If the Mini Moog with its 3 oscillators was considered the synth of fatness, the Odyssey was considered by many to be the synth of in-your-face snarling aggression. Described by Billy Currie and John Fox as the first punk synthesizer, the Odyssey had a bite and snarl to it that other instruments lacked, and that there was no other synth that cut through the sound of raucous guitars quite like the Odyssey. Of course, the test of an instrument's enduring appeal is its ability to be more than a one-trick pony, and while we love the image of punk guitarists turning round to the keyboard player and telling them to turn that shit down, the Odyssey was versatile enough to be used by a wealth of other players, including Herbie Hancock, who used it for things like the seriously funk-laden bass lines on Chameleon and Ready or Not, John Lord, Gary Newman, Chick Corea, Kraftwerk, The Carpenters, and many, many more. In terms of historical context, while the long-held belief is that in the 70s you were either an ARP or a Moog player, in truth this is as facile as the digital versus analog debate now. Sure, the marketing departments of both companies proudly proclaim their artist roster in a bid to capture sales from fans of those artists, but in truth both were equally valid as companies, and both the Mini and its rival the Odyssey were equally valid when it came to creating valid music. However, there were profound differences between each instrument, and none more immediately evident than the fact that the Mini Moog had knobs and the Odyssey had sliders. We've often thought that some of the differences were stage managed. Anyway, enough of the rhetoric. Let's have a look at the Odyssey's controls and see what's what. Starting on the left of the instrument, the first thing we see is the controls section, and here we have control over portamento time, a switch for pink or white noise, an octave selection switch where we can transpose the keyboard up or down 2 octaves, and finally the 3 buttons for what is known as proportional pitch control. These buttons effectively took the place of pitch and mod wheels, and were a new addition to late Model 2s and Model 3 Odysseys, while earlier Model 2s and before had a more simple pitch wheel. The idea with PPC buttons was that the harder you pressed, the more modulation or pitch bend took effect. In our experience, the reality was the harder you pressed, the more you hurt your thumb or fingers, and we think there's probably a good reason why pitch and mod wheels became de rigueur. Moving on to the first of the Odyssey's 2 oscillators, the first thing that strikes many people is, where the hell do I select the oscillator waveform? Now we'll get to that in a moment, but in this section you have control over coarse and fine tune via those sliders, plus a host of modulation possibilities where you can modulate pitch with a sine or square wave, sweep the pitch via the ADSR envelope settings, or introduce sample and hold. Also, when using the square wave as the oscillator waveform, you can change the pulse width and modulation depth, and you can also modulate this via a sine wave or sweep it with the ADSR envelope. Oscillator 2 is almost identical, except for the ability to introduce hard sync. Indeed, the Odyssey, we believe, was the first synth to have a sync function. It also forgoes square wave pitch modulation in favour of the sample and hold settings defined in the forthcoming sample and hold mixer section, or via an external pedal. Oh, and before we leave the oscillators, did we mention the instrument is duophonic? Yep, you can play 2 notes on the Odyssey, but obviously these notes take up 1 oscillator each. The mixer section contains a single LFO, and here you have the ability to set its rate. This rate then determines the speed of the modulation selected with each of the aforementioned oscillators. Underneath the LFO rate slider is a really neat sample and hold section where we can introduce all manner of waveforms into the equation, both in terms of pitch and filter modulation. Finally, in the mixer section, there's what's called an output lag slider, which generates a glide effect between the voltage steps and effectively smooths off the edges of the LFO waveforms. And this, when used in conjunction with the keyboard trigger selection, is one of our favourite features of the instrument that we'll come back to later. Next up is the main mixer section, and it's here where the filter settings are applied. Naturally, cut-off and resonance are available, as well as a very simple high-pass filter, which is useful for removing things like low-end rumbles. The award for the most useless slider on the Odyssey must go to the VCA gain slider. Now, over the years, this little beauty has been the cause of many Odyssey technical support questions, mainly inquiring, how do I get the instrument to stop making a continual noise? The answer? Turn it down. Below cut-off and resonance is the audio mixer, and it's here where we select our oscillator waveforms for VCOs 1 and 2, via switchable sawtooth and square wave options and sliders to control the level. Yep, it may seem bizarre, and when faced with an Odyssey for the first time, we've seen people take anything up to an hour to get a sound out of it due to this anomaly. But if you think about this entire section as a mixer section, where each of the Odyssey's modules are introduced into the equation to create an overall sound, it begins to make sense. In this section, you also have a ring modulator which you can introduce into the equation too. And it's with this that the instrument's raucous nature starts to become very evident. Using ring mod in conjunction with oscillator sync or the wealth of pitch modulation available, this can lead to what's best described as clangorous or thunderous results. Alternatively, you can use this to reinforce the oscillator tones for added bite. Fantastic for solos, and undoubtedly the feature that gave Billy and all the ability to cut through those punk guitars. Particularly when you use the instrument duophonically. Just listen to that bite and balls. And when we move outside the obvious harmonics, things get even nastier still. Filter modulation has a switchable option of sine or sample and hold, the latter taking its settings from the sample and hold mixer and being introduced here via the slider. And what better place to have the envelope depth sliders too. But here's where you might notice something slightly odd, because if you look closely, you'll see that the switches for the filter envelope depth and amplitude envelope depth give a choice between ADSR and AR. And if we correlate this with the actual envelope section of the instrument, we can see that this is indeed the case. In the upper part, we have attack and release, and below this, we have a normal ADSR. Strange but true, and actually in practice is pretty good. Lastly, underneath the ADSR envelope we have an array of switches that give repeat and gate functions for both of the envelopes. These are brilliant additions, and using these you can get all manner of pulsing lines, perfect for bass. Naturally, there were shortcomings with the instrument, and the first one was reason enough to take our Odyssey and turn it into the Oddity. Yep, those bloody sliders. Now, as I'm sure you've heard during this video, unless you keep your Odyssey in a hermetically sealed environment, the Odyssey's sliders are predestined to become as scratchy as hell, and in some cases stop working altogether. Ours definitely needs a couple replacing, but hey ho, such are the joys of maintaining and caring for old analogue gear. That and the idea of patch memories was enough for us to put our heads down and get to work. And that was before we came up with the whole patch morphing feature that really does take the Odyssey into a new dimension. But while we're on the subject of sliders, the eagle-eyed of you will notice that there's no 440 tuning reference on the instrument at all. And this means that live, the instrument is a pig. Granted, ARP's oscillators were more stable than its rivals, but if you've got no reference for tuning, things are definitely going to get messy. If you can get VCO1 into tune, if you want to step VCO2 up an octave, things are going to get messy. And that's one reason why Billy Currie and Chick Corea and the likes are held in such high regard. They had the uncanny ability to freak out on these machines with oscillator sync and ring modulation a go-go, and yet somehow managed to return everything to near as damn it perfect pitch. Little short of amazing. Now, I mentioned earlier about the sample and hold section, and as our final glance at the instrument, I'll show you one of my favourite things about it. Having set the filter up like so, we now head back to the sample and hold mixer to introduce both a sawtooth and a square wave. We're going to set the LFO so that it triggers via the keyboard as opposed to running continuously. Now, as such, every time we play a note, the LFO is re-triggered and will have a different value. If we assign this to our filter, this means that for every note on, our filter will have a different value too. Finally, remember that output lag slider? Well, this rounds off the angular edges of the LFO and creates a fantastic wah effect with each note played. This works especially well on the Odyssey as it has the ability to switch into duophonic and monophonic mode. Place it into mono mode and jam away until your heart's content. There were approximately 13,000 Odysseys produced over 3 models and colours between 72 and 81. No matter which model you opt for or lust after, there's something inherently brilliant about the Odyssey, both in terms of tones and feature set. It can be used to create anything, from punchy basses to wild sync leads to complex effects and percussion sounds. And what's more, it does it all in a manner where you want to experiment, where you're drawn in by both the aural and tactile characteristics that this little beast exudes and entices you with. It is an instrument, and it feels like one and it plays like one. Now, in our opinion, the 2600 is fantastic, but it's more derived from a piece of lab kit than it is a real instrument. And that's why the Odyssey is different. That's why the Odyssey is special. It is an instrument, and rightfully deserves its place right alongside the Minimoog as a genuine classic synth.